Hi everybody, welcome to week 2 of class, which is the first week of our real lecture series going on here from me. As I mentioned in week 1 when I talked about the syllabus and all of that good stuff, I'm trying to just do 10 to 15 minute videos here, hopefully no longer than 20 minutes, for these shorter videos that supplement the readings that you're going to be doing. In the nature of a class like this, I just don't have the time to fully go over all of the readings. Those are things you're going to have to do on your own to provide you the background for discussion posts and all of the information that you'll need for assignments. And so this is just me compiling some of the things that I think are useful for you throughout the week, as well as giving you some information that I feel like has not been covered that is really important to understanding what you're covering in a given week. At the end of each of these, I will spend a little bit of time talking about the assignment and giving you some guidance in that regard. If you have further questions about that, send me an email. I will also keep you up to date with announcements. So for week 2, just jumping right in here, the readings that you've been doing, Alexander and Danilov, as well as the ASTC website, are all centered around a similar issue, which is defining science museums or science center institutions and their history, so that you have that foundational background for what we're doing for the rest of the semester when we're covering these types of institutions and the exhibits that are present in these types of institutions. So that being said, I do want to briefly go back over what we covered in week 1, since you didn't have a discussion board post aligned to this. I want to make sure that we're covering generally what we're talking about when we talk about museums, talk a little bit about public historians and museums, and then get into some of the key themes that I want us to know for this given week. So to start us off here, when we're looking at museums, the Dillenberg article kind of short and sweetly gets us into asking these questions about what museums really are, what they entail, what we mean when we talk about museums. And so I want to, generally cover this and make sure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about museums, and that there are some similarities amongst museums, but as Dillenberg notes, anybody who wants to call themselves a museum can do so, right? So there are things that we can say that we think all museums do or contain, and then we can see other types of examples of museums that don't have this thing that we think are really, really important, right? So we have typically in a museum, we have some sort of collection of objects or artifacts that are being preserved, right? Conserved, as we see in the second bullet point here. And then those collections that are being conserved or preserved are being exhibited or presented to the public with some sort of interpretation, right? Even if you put the objects out into an exhibit, the order that you place them in, the objects that you choose to put out onto the floor, all of those require a level of interpretation present by whoever is in charge of that aspect of the museum. Oftentimes, a museum is also going to try to educate the people that it's presenting these exhibits to through the interpretation that they feel best fits whatever topic it is that they're covering, right? For an outside of classroom sort of educational experience, there are many people who would attribute museums as one of the main educational institutions outside of a classroom environment, and so that's one of the major roles in which they fulfill. Many museums are also nonprofit institutions, right? They're not making money off of the work that they do. Most of the time, museums are service-based institutions. They have some sort of goal that they are trying to fulfill. It's part of their mission, the work that they do in which they serve the public. So there's definitely examples, as you can see here in this slide that was created by the Smithsonian, right, the major museum institution here in the United States, that there's examples that don't follow this. There are types of museums that you may not have considered to be a museum, right? Something like a zoo or an aquarium has living collections. Botanical gardens have collections as well, just not in the way that we tend to think of them as historians. And then places like historical societies may at times do exhibits, but may not primarily focus on exhibits. As you'll be able to tell in both the Alexander and the Dillenberg readings, there can be different interpretations on what we feel like the main defining feature of what makes or breaks a museum is. Dillenberg, right, is going to primarily focus on exhibition. He feels if that if exhibits aren't present, then it's not a museum. And if they're not central, right? So if we look at other examples of places that have exhibits, like schools or hospitals or libraries or airports, their primary function isn't to do this sort of exhibition work. We could also argue that their primary role, right, isn't to do collection-based work or conservation-based work. And so museums are this kind of fuzzy definition, but both of these readings are going to make the argument that there are some general guiding lines that help us define what makes a museum and what doesn't make a museum. Oftentimes museums are also in a physical space. I will let you look at these links later on, but there are, of course, examples of museums that are solely online, collections being able to be viewed online in high quality. And the unique ways in which we can do exhibits also allows for the idea that it doesn't have to be in a physical location for a museum to be present. So that's generally what we're talking about when we talk about museums. Our concern for this class this semester is, of course, on a science museum and all of its different variations, which we'll talk about in a second. But before we get to that, I do want to briefly talk about not just what museums are and understanding museums, but making sure that we all understand our particular role as public historians or historians working in a museum context. So public history, which you may or may have not have heard of as a field before, is essentially applied history, taking historical knowledge and from the academy and applying it into a public setting. So museums is one of the many different ways in which public historians can do this type of work. There's preservation, there's working in legal fields, there's archival work. You can do a wide range of things, but since we're concerning ourselves with museums, that's where we're going to stay for the purposes of this class. So public historians, right, the role that they have in a museum field, which is an interdisciplinary field, we have people who come from, anthropology or science or marketing and public relations or education. There's a lot of different fields in which people do museum work, and so we want to see specifically what historians bring to the field. So public historians, right, as historians bring a knowledge and mastery of history as a discipline to the museum field. There are programs in the last 30 years or so that are centered on museum studies, of which some historians may enter, but museum studies is a little bit different in the sense that people who go into museum studies are concerning themselves with all of the aspects of the field and the logistics of running a museum. Whereas historians are coming from a role of expertise, just like we would see in like the sciences or anthropology, and using our experience with historical research and interpretation, going into the archives, analyzing primary and secondary sources to contribute to all the different aspects that are present within a museum, which range from, right, educational programming, exhibit programming, collection acquisition, and development, right, fundraising type of work. And so there are a lot of different jobs that a public historian could do in a museum context, right? You could be a curator, you could create exhibits, you could also be in charge of collections, trying to account for the things that come into the institution, choosing which things are going to be accessioned, how to make these things available for researchers from inside and outside of the institution. If it's an educational sort of focus and you're working on programming, say for school groups to an institution, right, you would know about and be able to design programs that target the resources within the museum to visitors through your own history knowledge. And then finally, conservation work, right, in combination with some sort of conservation educational background, you would have a knowledge of how to maintain the integrity of objects using your historical background. So the reason why I'm talking about this is because I'm going to be asking you throughout this semester to use your specific background as a historian and the contributions you would make in trying to analyze and to create your own exhibit that is tied to science and technology in a museum context as a historian. So that leads us, right, to our next point, and the thing that we have to contend with when we're talking about this particular topic, is that you may notice when you read these things that many examples in which we're looking at science and technology in museums is that we're not looking at history museums, right? We're not looking at, say, the Phoenix History Museum. Although history museums may have science and technology exhibits from time to time, for the most part this semester we're going to be looking at museums that their primary focus is science and technology, in which they may or may not cover the historical aspects of that particular innovation or change. So that being the case, as historians, we know that science and technology's impact on history has been immense, right? That science and technological developments are agents in and of themselves in creating historical change. So it's important for us to be able to engage with that reality in a public context, not just in discussions in the classroom, or if you advance to a graduate level, writing a book for other academics about that sort of development. But we should, as historians, our role in our profession, we should be concerned with how these things are being presented to the public, of which the museums are one of the primary ways in which people learn outside of classroom environment. And so this is the reason why we're looking at the museum and other exhibit-like spaces as an arena for how science and technology narratives are presented, and the value that historians can play in helping enrich that narrative for a diverse audience. And for the purposes of this class, we're looking primarily at the United States. So when you look at the readings, you will notice, right, Alexander and Danilov are the two major sources that we're looking at here. Alexander and Alexander, I'm going to give you 2 chapters on, which look at 2 different types of science museums. The first is going to be the Natural History Anthropological Museum, and the second is going to be Science and Technology Museums, or science centers, of which you're probably more aware, some of the more popular museums around the world today. Alexander and Alexander is going to give you a general historical background of both of these types of institutions, while Danilov is going to give you a further breakdown of that second type of museum, the technology museum, science center sort of institution, and tell you about all of the different types of museums that fall under that definition. So he has comprehensive centers, and he'll talk about, say, like an industry-centered comprehensive center and what that means, a specialized center, a limited center. You don't have to memorize all of these different types. What we're really trying to get a sense of when we look at these definitions and the histories of these institutions is that it affects how we think about science and technology, and history, of course, plays a role in how these things have been presented over time, right? So what we'll see, first of all, is that what we consider to be science has changed based on a particular time period. Some of the things that are present in the Natural History Museum, we would not necessarily consider to be a scientific sort of analysis or scientific field today, but at the time period it was, right? Or things that we didn't necessarily consider to be important in a science-based institution like a museum in this early period, now all of a sudden does become important because of historical changes, right? So these definitions change. Because these definitions change, narratives also change in terms of how these ideas are presented in museums, right? There are within these institutions, every institution like this will have a mission statement. When I have you evaluate specific institutions going forward, when I have you choose an institution for your exhibit that you're going to be thinking of, I am going to be concerned with what the mission of the institution is that you're evaluating, because the mission of the museum plays a heavy role in what type of exhibits it offers and what it says in those exhibits, right? So it's not just about what types of science are being presented, but how they're being presented, the stories that we're telling about these things when we tell them. So because we are historians, right, we're always concerned with narrative, the story that's being told about historical events. And so this is going to be the case for the remainder of this class, it's going to be our primary focus, is how narrative is presented in museum exhibits about science and about technology, right? And so this is a fusion of things that you have learned in the past, this being a 400 level class, right? Your understanding specifically of American history and different time periods in American history, which is your academic background, and then the study that we're going to undertake together throughout the semester, which is on museum theory and practice. So you're bringing things with you to help you formulate your final project in this class, which will take this knowledge, new knowledge of museums, of science and technology, with your historical background. So we will get to that point throughout this semester. For this week, what I'm concerned about is making sure that we have that foundation in place, which is knowing the different types of science and technology museums that exist, the types of exhibits that they're doing, and how they present their information. And so since we're looking at so many different types, right, there are different focuses depending on the type of institution, but when we're generally talking about the popular science center today, there are a few key pieces that we see playing out, which you should be able to tell from the readings. The first of which, right, is going to be a focus on an interactive sort of exhibit, right? You don't just, like a traditional history museum, walk up to an object, read some text, look at the object, shuffle over a little bit, and then look at some more things and read some more things and then shuffle over a little bit, right? You're actually pushing buttons, pulling levers, standing on things, doing some more interactive work than you tend to do in other types of museum-like institutions. There's also, right, a move away, because we're not using that sort of environment of focusing on the object or the product that gets created from scientific innovation or technological innovation. Instead, a lot of these museums focus on what's known as the process of science, right? Teaching the visitor how science works, right, through these interactive sort of exhibits. So tied into both of these things is what's known as edutainment, right? There is an educational component. There's always, in most science-based centers and museums, some sort of educational component, but it's always entertaining. It's somewhere that you would want to return again and again. It's somewhere where you would want to take your kids, and your kids are going to be engaged as they spend their time there. It's not something that feels old or stuffy like we tend to think of other types of museum institutions. The last thing that we're going to focus on going forward, I won't talk about this week, is science's role in progress, how it presents ideas of progress for different regions and different peoples. We will talk about that next week, but you will get a sense of that in the readings this week as well. So when you look at how this narrative happens, how science and technology museums is presented, there is a general timeline that's going to emerge through the readings that are about key historical developments that impact changes in science and technology that then, because they impact society, there's kind of this twofold thing going on. There's the people who are creating science and technology, either they're funding it or they're engineering it, that want to present a narrative of science and technology to sell the product, right? Or sell the idea behind why they're doing these things. And then on the flip side of that, the other thing that we always have to be concerned about with museums is what's going on with the visitor, right? What does the visitor want to see? And so there's these major innovations or changes that people fear or are excited for, that they have demands, right, on these institutions to explain these things to them. And so both of those things are happening simultaneously in these major points that I've listed here, where we have this kind of coming together of creating institutions that start to try to explain science and narratives about science to the public. And so I won't go over these in a whole lot of depth because I don't want this video to go on for too long. But as you notice here, I've kind of pinpointed the major points in Western, primarily US-based history, since that's what we're focusing on this semester. So we have kind of two major groupings, which is industrialization in the 19th century, and then Cold War era space race, arms race, Sputnik. So there are things that come out of these developments that you see in these other bullet points here, but those are the two major changes that essentially define what science and technology's purposes are and the changes that they have on society, which are massive changes, right? So when we look at the 19th century changes, we're looking at the political world, right? The economic world, imperialism, colonialism, all of those things are represented in how we present science and technology and their role for Western nations. We also have, professionalization of science as a field as these things become more solidified. And then we have World War II, this major global event, and then the rise of the Cold War. So we have a bunch of political and economic restructurings coming out of the war, right? Changes in terms of how previous imperial colonial nations start losing their power throughout the world. We're talking specifically in Asia and Africa, right? And then the rise of two superpowers, one of which is the United States and the other is which the Soviet Union, trying to establish themselves in this new world, right? This new political and economic world. And the United States, right, is going to have principles of democracy and capitalism that are going to be tied into what we feel should be presented when we talk about science and we talk about technology and the role of the military industrial complex. In the more recent decades, we are looking at how this affects us going forward, how we think about our heritage and our history, what we feel like is a true or accurate representation of our past, but we will get into those debates as we go throughout the semester. But it's clear, right, that all of these developments will change how all of these different groups that we're talking about, museums, corporations, nations, the public, everybody thinks about science and thinks about technology and the concerns that they have with the developments that happen. So the last thing that I want to talk about here before I let you go is I did tell you I was going to give you some topics to consider. If you want or you look at this and you still are not really sure what direction you want to go in, you can definitely email me, but I wanted to give you some general ideas as you go forward. I do want us to stay American history centric. We're looking primarily at American history and American museum institutions in this class. If you have, some really clear international example you would like to do, then certainly shoot me an email and we can talk about that. But I did want to give you some general guidelines on topics that you could use for your hypothetical exhibit, of which you'll use, right, your background knowledge of American history to help you come up with the background information, the context that you'll use when you come up with your exhibit. So I divided these up in a few different themes and then examples within themes, right? So the key first one, which we looked at, right, 19th century changes, industrialization, brings a lot of different things. Certainly did not list them all here, right? But you have things like steam power, canals, the assembly line, the telephone, right? If you want to look at an agricultural sort of focus, you can look at different types of farming equipment, like the harvester, the cotton gin, any of those sorts of changes you can definitely use as your key focus for your final project. War is another major change, right? If we're looking at our second major catalyst of the change in science centers and presentations of science. We're looking at World War II and the aftermath of that, right? There are also earlier conflicts where you can look at technological innovations as well, right? So we can look at guns or ammunition. We can look at different types of transportation like tanks or ships. The atomic bomb and atomic weaponry, which we'll talk about going forward in this semester, is a key topic that you could definitely focus on for your project. Different types of materials that are created in wartime, like plastics or computing, which have way broader implications after the war is over, right? And then aviation and aerospace is also a major field here in the United States, especially if you're interested in like Southwestern sort of history you can focus on as well. If you're more interested in kind of the major domestic changes that happen as a result of technology, right, you can look at entertainment and you can look at home goods, right? There are developments in radio and telephone, even things like amusement park rides, and technology changes in that regard, and how people spend their leisure time is a huge development that comes as a result of science and technology. And then also literally within the home, right? Air conditioning, refrigeration, washers and dryers, electricity, the microwave, even things like Tupperware. This is where, especially if you're somebody who's interested, say, in like something like gender studies, you could get into what these sorts of changes have and the effects that they have on women and men and children in the household. The last major theme that I have here for you to think about is medicine, right? There are major medical innovations that have long-lasting changes on society, from physical aids to medications to surgeries, hygiene, vaccinations, all of that type of stuff. So if you're someone that's interested in medicine, it's also another way to go. There are definitely overlaps within these different examples among themes that you could address within a potential exhibit. Think about things that you have done projects on in the past or you remember from another class. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. The thing that I'm concerned about in this class is how we present these things to the public and how we create narratives that will actually work in a public context. So really, possibilities are endless. If you think of something that I haven't mentioned that you really want to do, send it in or send me an email beforehand if you're concerned on whether I'll accept it or not. The main thing that I'm going to say here is you have to think about what the narrative is. What do you want to say in the exhibit? It's not just that you think the topic is interesting. You have to have an argument, just like you do for a paper. There's something that you need to say in the exhibit when you present it. The second thing that you have to think about going forward is where will this type of exhibit be successful, especially if you're choosing something that you think is interesting because it's controversial, right? Think about where you would actually get funding to do an exhibit like this. So don't worry about the specific museum quite yet. Think more about your argument at this early point. I will give you feedback on that as we go. Otherwise, have a good week. If you have any questions about this lecture, about the readings, send me an email, cvale@asu.edu, and I will see you for week 3.